Sometimes life gives us a second chance when we least expect it, and sometimes that chance comes in the most unlikely form. After losing her husband, schoolteacher Clara Finch traveled west to start over, carrying nothing but her books and a heart full of determination. A weathered cowboy named Silas offered to build her schoolhouse for nothing more than coffee and a place to sleep. She thought she knew his type, another broken man seeking honest work. But when Silas carved a Latin inscription above the schoolhouse door and spoke the ancient words with perfect fluency, Clara's world tilted. This drifting cowboy quoted scholars like he'd lived among them. What secret was this mysterious man hiding from his past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Finch pressed her gloved hand against the simple gold band on her finger, feeling its familiar weight as the stagecoach lurched over another rut in the dirt road. Through the dust-covered window, the endless prairie stretched before her like an ocean of grass, so different from the cobblestone streets and brick buildings of Boston she'd left behind. The wedding ring caught a shaft of afternoon sunlight, and for a moment she could almost hear Thomas's gentle voice, reading Latin poetry by their parlor fire. Professor Thomas Finch had been everything a woman could want in a husband: kind, intelligent, devoted to his students at Harvard. Their modest home had overflowed with books, papers, and the warm conversations of two minds perfectly matched. Clara had assisted him with his research on classical literature, translating passages and organizing his notes. Those had been golden years, filled with purpose and love. Then the fever came. It swept through Boston like a cruel wind, taking the young and old alike. Thomas had been helping at the hospital, unable to turn away from suffering students and colleagues. Within a week, he was gone, leaving Clara alone with their books and memories of a life that felt like someone else's dream. The funeral had been well attended. Colleagues spoke of Thomas's brilliance, his dedication to learning, his gentle nature. But when the last mourner left and Clara stood alone in their empty house, surrounded by thousands of books that seemed to whisper of loss, she knew she couldn't stay. Every room held too many ghosts. The advertisement in the Boston Herald had seemed like providence. Schoolteacher wanted for frontier town. Room and board provided. Inquire Willow Bend, Kansas Territory. Clara had packed Thomas's most treasured books, sold everything else, and bought a ticket west. If she was going to start over, she reasoned, it might as well be completely. Now, 3 days of dusty travel later, she caught her first glimpse of Willow Bend. The town perched on a low rise above a meandering creek, its wooden buildings looking both hopeful and fragile against the vast sky. Main Street consisted of perhaps 24 structures, a general store, a saloon, a church with a modest bell tower, and various shops and homes scattered around them like afterthoughts. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of Murphy's boarding house, a 2-story building that had seen better days but maintained an air of respectability. Clara gathered her carpet bag and the precious satchel containing Thomas's books, stepping down into the Kansas dust with as much dignity as her travel-wrinkled dress would allow. "Miss Finch?" A portly man with kind eyes approached, removing his hat. "I'm Mayor Henderson. Welcome to Willow Bend." Clara shook his offered hand, noting the genuine warmth in his weathered face. "Thank you, Mayor Henderson. I'm eager to begin. We're mighty grateful you've come. Been nearly 2 years since we had proper schooling for the children." He gestured toward a group of buildings. "The widow Murphy runs the boarding house here. Clean rooms, good meals, and she's got a special fondness for educated folks." As if summoned by his words, a sturdy woman with graying hair emerged from the boarding house, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. "Mrs." Murphy had the look of someone who'd weathered many storms but kept her kindness intact. "Land's sake, you must be exhausted," she said, taking Clara's arm with motherly authority. "Come in, dear. I've got your room ready and a hot meal waiting." Over dinner that evening, Clara met several of Willow Bend's residents. There was Dr. Phillips, the town's only physician, who spoke longingly of medical journals and civilized conversation. The banker, Mr. Stiles, expressed hope that a proper school would attract more families to settle in the area. Most touching was young Timothy Morrison, a boy of perhaps 12, whose father had died in the war and whose mother worked long hours taking in laundry. "Can you really teach us about faraway places?" Timothy asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Ma says there are cities with buildings tall as mountains." Clara smiled, remembering Thomas's passion for nurturing young minds. "I can teach you about many things, Timothy. History, literature, mathematics, and yes, about cities and countries far from here." The next morning, Mayor Henderson walked Clara to the site where her schoolhouse would stand. It was a gentle hill overlooking the town, with a view that stretched for miles across the prairie. The morning breeze carried the scent of grass and wildflowers, and Clara felt something stir in her chest, the first flutter of hope she'd experienced since Thomas's death. "We've got the lumber ready," Henderson explained, "but we've been waiting for someone skilled enough to build it proper. A schoolhouse needs to be sturdy, last through our winters." Clara nodded, studying the site and mentally arranging desks and a blackboard in the structure she imagined. "Do you have a carpenter in mind?" "Well, that's where we might have found some luck," Henderson said, scratching his grizzled chin. "Fellow rode into town yesterday, looking for work. Says he's handy with tools and would be willing to build your schoolhouse in exchange for room and board. Seems honest enough." As they spoke, a figure approached from the direction of town. Clara saw a man of perhaps 40 years, tall and lean, wearing work clothes that had seen many miles. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who'd spent years under the open sky. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention, intelligent and watchful, holding depths that spoke of education and loss. "Morning, Mayor," the man said, removing his hat to reveal more of that prematurely silver hair. His voice was cultured, with careful pronunciation that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Miss Finch, this is Silas Boone. Silas, meet our new schoolteacher." Silas inclined his head respectfully. "Miss Finch, I understand you're in need of a schoolhouse." There was something in his manner that intrigued Clara, a formality that suggested good breeding, yet he wore it lightly, without pretension. "Mr. Boone, the mayor tells me you're willing to undertake the construction." "I am. I've built schools before, among other things." He gestured toward the site. "Good location. The children will have a fine view during their lessons." "What would you require in payment?" Clara asked, expecting to negotiate wages. Silas shook his head. "Room and board would suffice. Perhaps coffee, if Mrs. Murphy can spare it." "I'm not looking to make a profit, Miss Finch, just to keep my hands busy with honest work." Clara studied his face, noting the careful way he spoke, the respectful distance he maintained. Most drifting men would name a price, or at least hint at wanting something more than mere subsistence. This man asked for almost nothing, which made her wonder what he might be running from. "That seems more than fair," she said finally. "When could you begin?" "Tomorrow, if the weather holds." Silas replaced his hat and stepped back. "I'll start by surveying the site properly, then begin with the foundation. Should have it completed within the month." After he left, Henderson walked Clara back toward town. "Seems like a decent fellow," he mused. "Quiet, but polite. Mrs. Murphy says he paid for a week's room in advance, which speaks well of his character." Clara nodded, but her mind lingered on the brief encounter. Something about Silas Boone didn't quite fit the image of a drifting cowboy. The way he'd assessed the building site suggested knowledge of construction, yes, but also something more, an understanding of how light would fall through windows, how children's voices would carry in the space. Most curious of all was his speech, careful and educated, though he seemed to be making an effort to keep it simple. That evening, Clara sat in her small room at Murphy's boarding house, surrounded by Thomas's books. She'd unpacked his worn leather journal, filled with his notes on Latin poetry and classical philosophy. The familiar sight of his careful handwriting brought both comfort and pain. She thought about the day, about the kindness of the townspeople, and the hope she'd felt standing on that hill. Willow Bend might not be Boston, but it offered something she desperately needed: a chance to honor Thomas's memory, by teaching, by nurturing young minds the way he had. Through her window, she could see the site of the future schoolhouse, bathed in moonlight. Tomorrow, the mysterious Mr. Boone would begin building her new life, board by board. Clara touched her wedding ring again, whispering a small prayer that she was making the right choice. Far below in the boarding house common room, she could hear the low murmur of voices, Mrs. Murphy speaking with what was likely her new carpenter. Clara found herself curious about Silas Boone's story, about what had brought him to this remote place, asking for so little in return for skilled labor. She had a feeling that building the schoolhouse would reveal more than just her students' future home. Something told her that both she and Mr. Boone were carrying secrets, wounds that might heal in the process of creating something new together. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of change. The sound of hammering began before dawn, steady and rhythmic against the morning stillness. Clara had risen early, as was her custom, but found herself drawn to the window overlooking the schoolhouse site. In the grey light of daybreak, she could see Silas Boone's silhouette already at work, measuring and marking the foundation stones with mathematical precision. By the time she'd dressed and made her way up the hill with a basket of breakfast, Mrs. Murphy had insisted she carry. The sun had painted the prairie gold. Silas looked up from his work as she approached, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "You're an early riser, Mr. Boone," Clara observed, setting the basket on a makeshift table he'd constructed from sawhorses and planks. "Old habits," he replied simply, but she noticed how his eyes lingered gratefully on the coffee steam rising from the pot she'd brought. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful." Clara watched as he poured coffee into a tin cup, noting the care with which he handled even this simple task. "You mentioned you'd built schools before. Where was that?" "Back east," Silas said after a moment's pause. "Different lifetime." She sensed the conversation was closed for now, but her curiosity only deepened. As the morning progressed, Clara found herself returning to check on the progress, ostensibly to ensure everything met her requirements, but really because she was fascinated by Silas's methods. He worked with the precision of someone who understood not just carpentry, but architecture. Each measurement was exact, each angle carefully calculated. When she mentioned that she'd like the windows positioned to catch the morning light for reading, he nodded thoughtfully and adjusted his plans without question. "You understand the importance of proper lighting for study," Clara observed. Silas glanced up from his work. "Reading in poor light strains the eyes. Children shouldn't have to squint at their lessons." The comment was casual, but it revealed an understanding of education that went beyond simple construction knowledge. Clara filed it away with her other observations about this mysterious man. 3 days into the construction, Clara brought Thomas's Latin grammar book with her, intending to review some lessons while keeping Silas company during his afternoon break. The book was one of her most precious possessions, Thomas's personal copy, filled with his marginal notes and observations. She settled on a patch of grass nearby, opening to a familiar passage about Roman poetry. The afternoon was peaceful, filled with the sounds of Silas's work and the distant lowing of cattle. Clara became absorbed in Thomas's notes about Virgil's use of metaphor, remembering their long discussions about classical literature. A sudden gust of prairie wind caught the book, ruffling its pages. Clara reached for it, but the breeze lifted it from her grasp and sent it tumbling across the ground. Several loose papers scattered, and the book itself landed near where Silas was working. "Oh, no!" Clara scrambled to gather the scattered papers, her heart racing at the thought of losing any part of Thomas's work. Silas immediately set down his tools and helped collect the wayward pages. As he retrieved the book itself, Clara saw him pause, his eyes focusing on the open page. Instead of simply handing it back, he stood perfectly still, reading. Sed fugit interia, fugit irreparabile tempus, he said softly, his pronunciation flawless. But meanwhile time flies, irretrievable time flies. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The Latin quote was from Virgil's Georgics, and Silas had not only recognized it, but recited it with the accent and intonation of a classical scholar. She stared at him, her mind reeling. Virgil understood the weight of time, Silas continued, seemingly unaware of Clara's shock. How quickly the precious moments slip away while we're distracted by... He stopped abruptly, as if suddenly realizing what he'd revealed. You know Latin, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas's face went carefully blank. He handed her the book without meeting her eyes. I've heard that passage before. You quoted it perfectly. The pronunciation, the meter that's not something you pick up from casual hearing. Clara's heart was pounding. Who are you? For a long moment, Silas said nothing. He turned back to his work, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the hammer too tightly. I'm a carpenter building your schoolhouse, Miss Finch. Nothing more. But Clara's mind was racing, pieces clicking together like a puzzle suddenly illuminated. The careful speech, the understanding of educational needs, the precision of his work, and now this perfect classical Latin spoken with the fluency of years of study. That's not true, she said quietly. You're educated, formally educated. You've studied the classics. Silas's hammer struck a nail with unnecessary force. What I was doesn't matter, only what I am now. Clara felt a mixture of excitement and sympathy wash over her. Here was a man who clearly had a past involving serious scholarship, reduced to wandering and taking odd jobs. The tragedy of it reminded her painfully of her own loss, though his seemed to be of his own making, rather than fate's cruel hand. It matters to me, she said. I'm trying to build a school in the middle of nowhere, hoping to bring learning to children who might never see the inside of a real classroom. To discover that the man building it understands the value of education that matters very much. Silas stopped working entirely then. He set down his tools and turned to face her, and Clara saw something raw in his expression, pain, longing, and fear, all mixed together. You don't understand, Miss Finch. That man you're imagining, the scholar, the teacher, he's gone. Dead and buried as surely as if he'd been shot in the war. I'm what's left. And what's left isn't worth much beyond strong hands and basic carpentry. I don't believe that, Clara said firmly. Knowledge doesn't die. Learning doesn't just disappear. Whatever happened to change your circumstances, you're still the man who can quote Virgil from memory. Silas laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Memory is a curse sometimes, Miss Finch. Better to let the past stay buried. Clara thought of Thomas, of the way grief had nearly convinced her to pack away all his books and pretend that part of her life had never existed. The temptation to hide from learning, from anything that reminded her of what she'd lost, had been strong. I understand something about wanting to bury the past, she said softly. But I've learned that running from who we were doesn't make us who we're meant to be. For a moment, something flickered in Silas's eyes, hope, perhaps, or recognition. But then he shook his head and picked up his hammer again. The schoolhouse will be finished in 3 weeks, Miss Finch. After that, I'll be moving on. Best not to complicate things with questions about what can't be changed. Clara watched him return to his work, noting the firm set of his shoulders that said the conversation was over. But her mind was far from settled. She clutched Thomas's Latin grammar book to her chest, thinking of her husband's passion for teaching, his belief that education could transform lives. What tragedy had befallen this man to make him abandon learning? What could drive someone with obvious scholarly gifts to wander the frontier, building other people's dreams while rejecting his own past? That evening, Clara sat in her room with Thomas's journal open before her, but she found herself staring out the window toward the boarding house where Silas was staying. She thought about the pain in his voice when he'd spoken of burying the past, the way he'd pronounced that Latin as if the words were both beloved and cursed. Clara had come west to start over, to find a new purpose after devastating loss. But what if she'd found something else entirely, someone else who needed to rediscover his purpose? The thought both thrilled and frightened her. She touched her wedding ring, remembering Thomas's gentle encouragement whenever she doubted herself. What would he say about this mysterious man with the educated voice and the wounded eyes? What would he say about the way her heart had raced when Silas quoted Virgil with such beautiful precision? Outside her window, the half-built schoolhouse stood silhouetted against the stars, a promise taking shape board by board. But now, Clara wondered if it might become more than just a school. Perhaps it would become the place where two lost souls found their way back to who they were meant to be. The next few days passed in careful dance of curiosity and evasion. Clara found herself inventing reasons to visit the construction site, checking measurements, discussing window placement, bringing meals that Mrs. Murphy insisted were too much for one person. Each time, she tried different approaches to draw Silas into conversation about his past, and each time he deflected with the skill of someone well-practiced at avoiding personal questions. She began to notice small things that intrigued her further. The way he held his pencil when marking measurements, not like a tradesman, but with the precise grip of someone accustomed to extended writing. How he automatically straightened a stack of lumber, organizing it by length and quality with an efficiency that spoke of systematic thinking. Most telling was his reaction when she mentioned her plans for the curriculum. "I hope to teach basic Latin," Clara had said one morning, testing his response. "The children should understand the roots of language." Silas had paused in his work, just for a moment, but she caught the flash of interest before he controlled it. "Most frontier children won't have use for dead languages." "Latin isn't dead," Clara replied. "It lives in every word we speak, every law we write, every scientific discovery we make. Veritas, libertas, scientia, these concepts shaped civilization." She saw his lips twitch, almost forming words, before he caught himself. "You'll know better than I what these children need." But Clara was beginning to understand that he knew exactly what children needed, and that his careful distance from the subject was costing him something. Her breakthrough came by accident on a Thursday morning. She'd arrived early, carrying coffee and fresh bread, to find Silas's bedroll empty beside the construction site. For a moment she worried he'd left town, keeping his promise to avoid complications. Then she heard his voice, low and patient, coming from behind the partially framed building. Clara crept closer and peered around the corner. Young Timothy Morrison sat cross-legged in the grass, while Silas demonstrated something with a piece of charcoal on a flat board. "You see, Timothy, numbers aren't just for counting cattle or measuring grain," Silas was saying, his voice carrying the natural rhythm of a born teacher. "They're the language God used to design the world. Look here." He drew a triangle. "This shape appears in the strongest structures, from the pyramids of Egypt to the roof of a simple barn." Timothy's eyes were wide with fascination. "Really? The same shape in Egypt as on our barn?" "Exactly the same. Men discovered long ago that a triangle distributes weight perfectly. The ancient Greeks proved it mathematically, and every builder since has used that knowledge." Silas drew more lines, showing how triangular supports strengthened the schoolhouse frame. "Learning connects everything, Timothy. History, mathematics, building, it's all one great conversation across time." Clara's heart clenched at the passion in his voice, the natural ease with which he made complex concepts accessible to a child. This was no drifting cowboy, this was a teacher, perhaps a great one, hiding his light under a bushel of self-imposed exile. When Timothy scampered off to help his mother, Clara emerged from her hiding spot. Silas saw her and immediately began gathering his impromptu lesson materials, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I was just the boy was curious about the construction," he said quickly. "You were teaching," Clara said softly, "and doing it beautifully." Silas's hands stilled on the charcoal. "I shouldn't have. It's not my place." "Who says it's not your place? You made triangles and pyramids come alive for that child. You connected ancient Egypt to his everyday world in 5 minutes." Clara stepped closer. "That's a gift, Mr. Boone, a rare one." For a moment, Silas's careful mask slipped, and she saw naked longing in his eyes. Then he turned away, busying himself with organizing tools. "I agreed to build your schoolhouse, Miss Finch, not to complicate your teaching." "What if I wanted the complication?" Clara asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "What if I told you these children could benefit from another teacher, someone with obvious knowledge and passion?" Silas shook his head firmly. "You don't know what you're asking. Then tell me. Help me understand why a man who can make mathematics poetry for a 12-year-old insists he has nothing to offer." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the morning breeze through the grass. Clara held her breath, sensing she was close to something important. Then fate intervened in the form of a gust of wind that caught Silas's saddlebag, which he'd left propped against a sawbuck. The leather bag tumbled over, spilling its contents across the construction site. Clara automatically bent to help gather the scattered items, spare clothes, shaving supplies, a few tools. Her hand closed on a small, stiff rectangle of paper. Without thinking, she turned it over and found herself staring at a daguerreotype photograph. The image showed a young man in academic robes, standing beside a university building. The formal portrait bore the unmistakable markers of scholarly achievement, the carefully arranged books, the dignified pose, the inscription at the bottom that read, "Professor Silas Boone, Department of Classical Studies, 1859. Clara's breath caught. The man in the photograph was unmistakably Silas, perhaps 15 years younger, his face unmarked by whatever sorrows had driven him to this wandering life. He stood with quiet pride among the trappings of academic success, everything he claimed to have buried forever. "You weren't just educated," Clara whispered, looking from the photograph to Silas, who had gone very still. "You were a professor." Silas reached for the daguerreotype with a hand that trembled slightly. "That man is dead." "No, he's not." Clara's voice grew stronger with conviction. "He's standing right here, building a schoolhouse and teaching triangles to lonely children. He's just forgotten who he is." "You don't understand." Silas's voice carried years of pain. "Professor Silas Boone had everything: position, respect, a future. He lost it all through his own weakness and cowardice. What you see now is what's left, and it's not enough to deserve that title again." Clara studied his face, seeing past the weathered features to the intelligence and compassion that no amount of self-exile could erase. "What happened to you?" For a long moment, Silas stared at the daguerreotype in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I was professor of classical studies at Millbrook College in Pennsylvania. Small school, but respected. I had students who loved learning, colleagues who valued my work, a life built around books and ideas." He paused, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph. "Then the war came, and everything changed." Clara waited, sensing that pushing would only drive him back into silence. "I enlisted because it seemed the honorable thing to do, left my position, my students, everything I'd built." Silas's voice grew bitter. "Spent 3 years watching boys die for causes they barely understood, using my education to write reports about battles that accomplished nothing but filling graveyards." "The war ended," Clara said gently. "You could have returned to teaching." Silas looked at her then, and she saw something broken in his eyes. "I tried, but the man who came back wasn't the same one who'd left. I'd seen too much, lost too much. The classical ideals I'd taught, honor, courage, the nobility of human nature, they seemed like children's stories after what I'd witnessed." Clara felt her heart ache for this man, who'd lost not just his position, but his faith in the very principles he'd devoted his life to teaching. She understood now why he insisted the professor was dead. He'd killed that hopeful, idealistic man himself, unable to reconcile his scholarly beliefs with the brutal realities he'd experienced. "So you left," she said. "I ran," Silas corrected harshly. "Abandoned my students, my responsibilities, everything." Became exactly what the war had taught me. I was a coward, pretending to be something better. Clara looked again at the daguerreotype, at the young professor's confident smile, then at the weathered man before her who'd spent years punishing himself for surviving when his ideals hadn't. "You're wrong," she said quietly, and something in her tone made him look up. "You didn't abandon anything. You're still teaching, still sharing knowledge, still making learning come alive for curious minds. You just forgot that wisdom earned through suffering might be the most valuable kind of all." The discovery of the daguerreotype changed everything between Clara and Silas, though neither acknowledged it directly. Their conversations during work breaks grew longer, more personal. Clara found herself sharing stories about Thomas, about their life together, and the devastating emptiness his death had left behind. In return, Silas began to reveal fragments of his former life, memories of eager students, the satisfaction of helping young minds discover the beauty of ancient literature, the way Latin poetry had once made his heart soar. "Thomas taught classics too," Clara said one afternoon, sitting in the shade of the half-completed schoolhouse walls. "He used to say that Latin was the backbone of all learning, that understanding it was like having a key to unlock centuries of human thought." Silas nodded, his hands busy carving what appeared to be decorative trim for the window frames. "Your husband was wise. I used to tell my students that Latin wasn't a dead language but a sleeping one, waiting in the roots of every word they spoke." "You said used to again," Clara observed gently. "But the way you explain it now, it's still alive in you, that love of teaching." Silas's carving knife paused. "Love doesn't always survive reality, Miss Finch. Sometimes what we love most becomes what we can no longer bear to touch." Clara watched his hands resume their careful work, noting the precision and artistry in every cut. What if touching it again was the only way to heal? Their eyes met for a moment, and Clara saw something flicker there, hope, perhaps, or the ghost of it. Then Silas looked away, focusing intently on his carving. "Tell me about your wife," Clara said, shifting the subject to what she sensed was even more painful territory. Silas's hands went completely still. For so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer, he sat silent. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. "Margaret. She was the daughter of the college president, but that's not why I loved her. She had this way of listening, really listening, when I talked about my work. Most people's eyes would glaze over when I discussed irregular Latin verbs or the intricacies of Cicero's rhetorical style. But Margaret would ask questions that showed she understood not just what I was saying, but why it mattered to me." Clara felt a pang of recognition. "She sounds like Thomas in that way. He made me feel like my thoughts were valuable, worth hearing." Margaret was studying to become a teacher herself. "We planned to work together someday, maybe start our own school." Silas's voice grew softer, more distant. "We had a son, James, just 2 years old when I enlisted." He had Margaret's eyes and her quick mind already speaking in full sentences, asking endless questions about everything he saw. The past tense made Clara's heart ache. "What happened to them?" Silas set down his carving tools, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "Influenza epidemic swept through town in the winter of '63. I was in Virginia, fighting in the mud and cold, writing letters home about how much I missed them. Margaret wrote that they were both feeling poorly, but she didn't want to worry me. By the time I got word that they were seriously ill, by the time I could get leave to come home." He stopped, unable to finish. Clara reached out instinctively, covering his work-roughened hand with her own. "They were already buried when I arrived," he said finally. "Side by side in the college cemetery, under a stone that said, 'Beloved wife and mother, cherished son.' I'd been planning lessons for James, thinking about the books I'd read to him when he was older. Instead, I stood in the snow and read their names on granite." Clara felt tears blur her vision. "I'm so sorry, Silas." He looked at her then, and she saw that he'd noticed her use of his first name. The formality they'd maintained was dissolving, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous. "I tried to go back to teaching after that," Silas continued. Stood in front of classrooms full of young men not much older than my James would have been, tried to make them care about dead poets and ancient philosophy. But every eager face reminded me of what I'd lost. Every question about Latin conjugations felt like a mockery of the conversations I'd never have with my son. So you left the college. I ran away from everything that reminded me of them, of the life we'd planned together. Kept running until I ended up here, building other people's dreams, because I didn't have the courage to rebuild my own. Clara squeezed his hand, understanding now the full weight of his self-imposed exile. You didn't run from cowardice, Silas. You ran from unbearable pain. There's a difference. Is there? His voice held years of self-recrimination. Margaret believed in the power of education, the importance of passing knowledge to the next generation. If she could see me now, she'd see a man who's been carrying grief for 10 years and is finally ready to lay it down, Clara said firmly. She'd see someone who still loves learning enough to teach triangles to lonely children, who carves beauty into wood even when he thinks no one is watching. Silas looked down at his hands, still covered by hers. You don't know me as well as you think. I know you've been writing, Clara said quietly, and his head snapped up in surprise. I found a piece of wood yesterday with poetry carved into it. Beautiful lines about prairie sunsets and the way grass moves in wind. That's not the work of a man who's given up on beauty. Silas pulled his hands free, his face flushing. You shouldn't have. That was private. Poetry isn't meant to be private. It's meant to be shared, to help others see the world through new eyes. Clara leaned forward. You've been writing again because something in this place, in this work, is calling that part of you back to life. Don't romanticize this, Clara. The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her, even as his tone warned her off. I'm a broken man building your schoolhouse. When it's finished, I'll move on, and you'll find a proper teacher for these children. What if I don't want you to move on? The words slipped out before Clara could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a bridge neither had intended to build. Silas stared at her for a long moment, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. Then he stood abruptly, gathering his tools. That would be a mistake, Clara, for both of us. But as he walked away, Clara noticed that he didn't deny wanting to stay, and when she looked at the wood shavings scattered around where he'd been working, she saw that his decorative trim was actually an intricate pattern of leaves and vines, a border that would frame the windows like illuminated manuscript pages, bringing art and beauty to her simple schoolhouse. That evening, Clara sat in her room with Thomas's journal open before her. But instead of reading her late husband's notes, she found herself writing her own thoughts. About grief and healing, about the unexpected ways life offered second chances, about a mysterious man who claimed to be finished with learning but couldn't stop teaching, couldn't stop creating, couldn't stop the love of knowledge from bleeding through his careful defenses. Outside her window, she could see a faint light in Silas's room at the boarding house. She wondered if he was writing too, carving poetry into scraps of wood, trying to make sense of feelings he'd thought were buried forever. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of coming rain and the promise of things growing in unexpected places. As the schoolhouse took shape, so did something neither Clara nor Silas had expected, a sense of shared purpose that went beyond mere construction. The building was more than halfway complete now, its frame solid against the prairie sky, its windows positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. But it was the details that revealed Silas's true nature. Hand-carved molding around the doorframe, carefully fitted floorboards that would never creak or sag, and built-in shelves, designed specifically to hold the books Clara treasured. You've put more work into this than any contract would require, Clara observed one morning, running her fingers along the smooth surface of a reading bench. Silas had built beneath the largest window. Good work is its own reward, he replied, but Clara caught the flush of pride in his cheeks. This was a man who had forgotten the satisfaction of creating something beautiful, something that would outlast his own lifetime. Word of the schoolhouse's progress had spread throughout the county. Families who had never considered formal education for their children began stopping by to see the work in progress. Clara found herself fielding questions about curriculum, enrollment, and teaching methods, questions that excited her more than she'd expected. "Will you teach reading to all ages?" asked Mrs. Patterson, whose eldest daughter was 16 but had never learned more than basic letters. "Sarah's been wanting to learn, but she feels foolish starting so late." "Learning has no age limit," Clara assured her. "We'll have different levels for different needs." As these conversations unfolded, Clara became aware that Silas was listening intently, occasionally offering suggestions about classroom arrangement or teaching techniques. His input was always valuable, revealing an understanding of pedagogy that went far beyond his claimed experience. "You might consider setting up smaller study areas," Silas said one afternoon after a group of parents had left. "Some children learn better in intimate settings rather than large groups." "That's an excellent suggestion," Clara replied. "Did you find that effective in your own teaching?" Silas caught himself, realizing he'd revealed more than intended. "I just remember being a student once." But Clara was beginning to recognize the pattern. Silas's knowledge ran too deep, his insights too sophisticated to be mere memories of his own schooling. He was a natural teacher fighting against his own instincts, and the battle was becoming harder to maintain. The breakthrough came through young Timothy, who had taken to spending every free moment at the construction site. The boy's hunger for knowledge was evident in his constant questions, his eagerness to help with any task, his wonder at every new aspect of the building process. "Mr. Boone," Timothy said one afternoon, watching Silas carve a decorative panel for the teacher's desk, "how do you know exactly where to make each cut? It's like you can see the pattern inside the wood." Silas paused in his work, considering the question seriously. "Sometimes the pattern is already there, Timothy. The wood has its own grain, its own strengths and weaknesses. A good craftsman learns to work with those natural qualities rather than against them." "Like people?" Timothy asked with startling insight. "Ma says everyone has their own grain, their own way of learning things." Clara felt her breath catch at the boy's wisdom and Silas's thoughtful nod. "Your mother is very wise," Silas said. "Yes, exactly like people. A good teacher." He stopped abruptly, realizing where his words were leading. "A good teacher does what?" Timothy prompted, his young face bright with curiosity. Silas looked at Clara, who nodded encouragingly. "A good teacher learns to see each student's natural grain and helps them develop their own strengths, rather than forcing them into someone else's pattern." "Will Miss Finch be that kind of teacher?" Timothy asked. "I believe she will," Silas said quietly, his eyes meeting Clara's. "She has the gift of seeing people as they truly are." That evening, Clara found herself arranging the collection of children's slates that had arrived from back east. Each slate represented a student she hadn't yet met, a mind waiting to be awakened to learning. As she stacked them carefully on the shelves Silas had built, she found herself imagining the classroom filled with eager faces, young voices reading aloud, the scratch of slate pencils working through problems. But increasingly, her vision included another teacher, a tall, patient man who could make ancient history come alive, who understood that each child learned differently, who carried within him a love of knowledge too deep to be buried by grief. The next morning brought the first real test of the community's commitment to education. Clara arrived at the construction site to find a group of men gathered around Silas, their voices raised in what appeared to be an argument. "Unseemly for an unmarried woman to spend so much time alone with a drifter," one man was saying. "People are starting to talk, Miss Finch." Clara recognized Jebediah Morse, a farmer whose stern religious views made him suspicious of any deviation from strict propriety. Behind him stood two other men, their faces set in disapproving lines. "Mr. Morse," Clara said coolly, "Mr. Boone is building our schoolhouse. Naturally, I need to oversee the work." "Oversee from a distance, perhaps," Morse replied. "But you're out here every day, sharing meals, having private conversations. It's not proper behavior for a widow woman, especially one who's supposed to be setting an example for our children." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame but from indignation. My behavior has been entirely appropriate. Mr. Boone has shown nothing but respect and professionalism. Maybe so, said another man, but appearances matter. We can't have our schoolteacher's reputation questioned. My reputation is my own concern, Clara replied firmly, and I'll thank you not to dictate how I conduct my affairs. Throughout this exchange, Silas had remained silent, his face carefully neutral. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his tools. She realized with a pang that this was exactly the kind of complication he'd feared. Perhaps, Silas said quietly, it would be better if I worked alone from now on. The schoolhouse will be finished within the week. No, Clara said quickly, then forced her voice to remain calm. Mr. Boone's suggestion isn't necessary. We've done nothing wrong, and I won't be intimidated into changing proper oversight of an important project. Morse's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake, Miss Finch. People will stand for whatever serves their children's education best, interrupted Mayor Henderson, who had approached unnoticed. And what serves our children best is having their schoolhouse completed properly and on schedule. I suggest you, gentlemen, find more productive uses for your time than gossiping about two people who are working to better this community. The confrontation ended with muttered complaints and dark looks, but Clara knew the damage was done. The easy companionship she and Silas had developed was now suspect in some people's eyes, a scandal waiting to bloom into full gossip. After the men left, Silas gathered his tools with deliberate motions. I should finish this work quickly and move on, he said without looking at her, before more tongues start wagging. Is that what you want? Clara asked quietly. Silas's hands stilled on his tool belt. What I want doesn't matter. I won't be responsible for damaging your reputation or your position here. Clara stepped closer, studying his profile. What if I told you that what I want is for you to stay? Not just to finish the schoolhouse, but to help me teach these children who need what you have to offer. Clara, her name came out like a prayer and a protest combined. The way you explained craftsmanship to Timothy, the patience you showed when he asked endless questions. You have the heart of a teacher, Silas. These children could benefit from your knowledge, your experience. I'm not the man I was, he said firmly. I can't be what you need. You're exactly what these children need, Clara countered. Someone who understands that learning isn't just about memorizing facts, but about finding the patterns that make sense of the world. Someone who's lived through hardship and come out stronger. Silas finally looked at her, and Clara saw longing war with fear in his expression. You don't understand what you're asking. Then help me understand. Trust me enough to tell me the whole truth about why you're so afraid to teach again. For a moment, Clara thought he might finally open completely, might trust her with whatever last secret was keeping him from embracing the life she could see he wanted. But then he shook his head and turned back to his work. The schoolhouse will be finished by Friday, he said, his voice carefully controlled. After that, I'll be moving on. Clara watched him hammer nails with unnecessary force, each blow driving home his determination to leave just when she most wanted him to stay. But she also noticed that his hands shook slightly as he worked, and that he avoided meeting her eyes. Whatever was driving Silas away, it wasn't lack of feeling. It was something deeper, more painful than the losses he'd already shared. And Clara was beginning to understand that if she wanted to save this man from his self-imposed exile, she was going to have to fight for him, whether he wanted her to or not. The final week of construction passed in tense silence between Clara and Silas. He worked with focused intensity, arriving before dawn and laboring until darkness fell. The few times Clara attempted conversation, he responded with polite monosyllables that made clear he considered their earlier intimacy a mistake to be corrected. But Clara was not easily deterred. She had seen the man behind the careful walls he'd constructed, and she refused to let him disappear without a fight. If direct confrontation wouldn't work, she would find another way. Her opportunity came through Timothy, who continued to hover around the construction site despite Silas's increased reserve. The boys' fascination with learning was obvious, and Clara began bringing books to their afternoon visits, reading aloud while Silas worked. "What does this word mean, Miss Finch?" Timothy asked one afternoon, pointing to a passage in one of Thomas's volumes. "Redemption," Clara read aloud, aware that Silas had paused in his work. "It means to buy back something that was lost, to restore it to its original value. Like when Pa sold his watch during the bad winter, but Ma got it back for his birthday?" "Exactly like that," Clara agreed. "Sometimes the most precious things seem lost forever, but they can be redeemed if someone cares enough to fight for them." She felt rather than saw Silas's sharp look, but he said nothing. That evening, Clara made a decision that would have shocked the Boston society ladies she'd once known. She waited until the boarding house grew quiet, then slipped out into the prairie darkness and made her way to the schoolhouse. The building stood nearly complete in the moonlight, its windows like gentle eyes looking out over the town. Clara had brought Thomas's journal and a small oil lamp. She settled on the front steps and began to write by the flickering light. She wrote about loss and healing, about the courage required to begin again after devastating grief. She wrote about a man who carried ancient wisdom in weathered hands, who could make poetry from carpentry and philosophy from construction techniques. She wrote about recognizing kindred spirits and the responsibility to help them find their way back to themselves. "You shouldn't be out here alone at night." Clara looked up to find Silas approaching through the darkness, his face concerned and exasperated. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. "Sometimes writing helps me think." Silas hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and genuine worry for her safety. Finally, he settled on the steps beside her, careful to maintain a respectable distance. "What are you writing about?" "Second chances," Clara said. "The way life sometimes offers us opportunities to reclaim what we thought was lost forever." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the prairie wind whispering through the grass around them. Then Silas spoke, his voice thoughtful. "I've been working on something too." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a piece of wood, smooth and carved with intricate detail. In the lamplight, Clara could see it was a cross, beautifully crafted with flowing lines and delicate proportions. "For the schoolhouse?" she asked. "I thought if you approved it might go above the door. Nothing too bold, just a simple acknowledgement of the foundation all true learning rests upon." Clara examined the cross more closely, noting the subtle way Silas had worked Latin words into the design, spes and fides, intertwined in the flowing grain. "Hope and faith. It's beautiful," she said softly. "Did you carve words into the design?" Silas flushed slightly. "Old habits. In my teaching days, I always tried to weave different subjects together, show students how language, art, philosophy, and faith all connected." "Your teaching days aren't over, Silas." Clara set down her pen and turned to face him fully. "Not unless you choose to end them." "Clara, please don't." "Don't what? Don't care about what happens to you? Don't recognize that you're running from the very thing that could heal you?" Her voice grew passionate despite her efforts to remain calm. "I lost my husband, Silas. I know what it feels like when part of your soul dies with someone you love. But I also know that Thomas would be heartbroken if I buried my love of teaching along with his body." Silas was quiet for a long moment, turning the wooden cross over in his hands. "It's not that simple. Tell me why. Make me understand what's keeping you from the life you're meant to have." The silence stretched between them, filled with the night sounds of the prairie. Finally, Silas began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you about Margaret and James, about losing them while I was away at war. What I didn't tell you was how I found out." He paused, gathering courage. "I received a letter from Margaret's father, the college president. He wrote that they had died calling for me, that Margaret's last words were wondering why Papa wasn't coming home to take care of them." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, understanding now the full weight of his guilt. The letter said James had been asking for his papa every day, had been too young to understand why I wasn't there when he was frightened and sick. Silas's voice broke slightly. They needed me, Clara. They trusted me to protect them, and I chose duty over family. I chose abstractions like honor and country over the people who loved me most. You chose to serve your country, Clara said firmly. That's not a betrayal of your family, it's an expression of the values you wanted to pass to your son. Pretty words, Silas said bitterly, but they don't change the fact that my wife and child died alone because I wasn't brave enough to choose love over duty. Clara reached out and covered his hands with hers, feeling the roughness of years spent in physical labor. What if your real failure wasn't choosing duty over love, but choosing exile over redemption? Silas looked at her sharply. You've spent 10 years punishing yourself for surviving when they didn't. But what if the way to honor their memory isn't through self-exile, but through becoming the teacher Margaret believed you could be? What if giving your knowledge to children like Timothy is how you keep James's spirit alive? I'm not worthy. According to who? Clara's voice grew stronger. According to the guilt that's been eating you alive for 10 years? Or according to the God who carved hope and faith into your heart so deeply that they flow out through your hands, even when you're trying to forget them? Silas stared at the wooden cross, at the Latin words he'd carved, without fully realizing their significance. I don't know if I can teach again. I don't know if I remember how to reach young minds without thinking of the son I'll never teach. You've been teaching Timothy for weeks, Clara pointed out gently. Every question he asks, every explanation you give, you're already doing what you think you can't do. A long silence fell between them. Clara held her breath, sensing that this was the moment when Silas would either take the step back toward life or retreat permanently into his self-imposed exile. If I stayed, he said finally, if I tried to help you with the school, it couldn't be anything more than that. I'm not the man who could be a proper husband, Clara. Too much of me died with my family. Clara's heart leaped at the word stayed, even as it ached at his conviction that he was too damaged for love. I'm not asking for promises about the future, Silas. I'm asking you to give yourself permission to live in the present. Silas looked at her then, and Clara saw something shift in his expression, not the full surrender she hoped for, but a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. The schoolhouse will be finished tomorrow, he said quietly. After that, we'll see. It wasn't a commitment, but it was hope. Clara smiled, touching the wooden cross one more time. Hope and faith, she said softly. Sometimes that's all we need to begin again. The schoolhouse dedication was planned for the following Sunday, with families coming from across the county to witness the completion of Willow Bend's first proper school. Clara had spent the week preparing her opening address and arranging the desks and supplies donated by generous townspeople. The building stood complete and beautiful, its windows sparkling in the morning sun. Silas's wooden cross positioned perfectly above the doorframe. Silas had indeed stayed, though he remained careful about defining his role. He'd agreed to help with occasional instruction in practical subjects, mathematics, basic sciences, anything that didn't require him to fully embrace the title of teacher. It was a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely, but Clara was willing to accept gradual progress over losing him entirely. The morning of the dedication dawned clear and bright. Clara arrived early to make final preparations, her heart full of anticipation for this new beginning. She found Silas already there, making minor adjustments to the door hinges with the perfectionism she'd come to recognize as his trademark. Everything looks wonderful, she said, surveying the completed classroom with satisfaction. The children are going to love learning here. It's a good building, Silas agreed, but Clara heard something strained in his voice. It should serve the community well. Before Clara could ask what was troubling him, the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention to the window. A group of riders was cresting the hill, not families coming for the dedication, but men on official business. At their head rode a figure that made Silas go rigid beside her. "Dear God," he whispered, his face draining of color. The lead rider was a tall, stern-faced man wearing the blue uniform and badge of a federal marshal. As the group drew closer, Clara could see that the other men were deputies, their faces set with the serious expressions of those carrying out official duties. Marshal William Cross dismounted near the schoolhouse steps, his cold eyes scanning the building before settling on Silas. "Silas Boone?" "Yes," Silas answered quietly, his voice steady despite the fear Clara could see in his posture. "You're under arrest for desertion from the United States Army." The marshal's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You'll need to come with us." Clara's world tilted. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, ma'am." Marshal Cross pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Got a warrant here, issued by the War Department. Mr. Boone left his unit without permission in March of 1864 and never returned to complete his service." The blood rushed from Clara's face as she understood the implications. Desertion during wartime was a capital offense. Even years after the war's end, it could mean imprisonment, disgrace, or worse. "I can explain," Silas began. "You can explain to the military tribunal." Cross cut him off. "My job is just to bring you in." He gestured to his deputies. "We'll be leaving within the hour." Clara found her voice, stepping protectively closer to Silas. "Surely there are procedures, hearings. He has rights." "He had rights when he decided to abandon his post," the marshal said coldly. "Now he has consequences." As word of the arrest spread through town, a crowd began to gather. Clara saw familiar faces filled with shock and confusion. Mayor Henderson, Mrs. Murphy, young Timothy with tears in his eyes. The dedication celebration was transforming into something much darker. "There has to be more to this story," Henderson said, approaching the marshal. "Silas has been nothing but helpful to our community. He built our schoolhouse, worked with our children." "Don't matter what he's done since," Cross replied. "Law is law. He deserted during a time of war." Clara's mind raced, trying to process this devastating turn. Everything Silas had told her about his past had been true, but he'd left out this crucial detail. He hadn't just lost his family and his faith in his ideals. He'd also committed a crime that the government would never forget or forgive. "Marshal Cross," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Boone lost his wife and child during the war. Surely that provides context for—" "Ma'am, I understand you've gotten attached to this man. But the fact remains he broke his oath to the United States Army. Personal circumstances don't excuse treason." The word treason hit Clara like a physical blow. She saw Silas flinch, his shoulders sagging under the weight of shame he'd been carrying all these years. "How long has this warrant been active?" Clara asked, a desperate plan beginning to form in her mind. "Been looking for him for over 10 years. Cross admitted. "He's been good at staying hidden, moving around, never staying in one place long enough for word to reach us. But building a schoolhouse, that's the kind of thing that gets noticed, gets talked about in newspapers." Clara felt sick understanding that Silas's decision to stay and help her had ultimately led to his capture. His first instinct to keep moving, to avoid putting down roots, had been right, at least from the perspective of avoiding this moment. "I need time to gather his things," Clara said quickly. "Surely you can allow that much." Cross consulted his pocket watch. 15 minutes. Then we ride." As the marshal and his men retreated a short distance to water their horses, Clara pulled Silas aside, her heart breaking at the defeat in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because I knew how it would sound," Silas replied, his voice hollow. "Because I knew that no matter how I explained it, I'd still be exactly what that marshal called me, a deserter and a traitor. Tell me what really happened." Silas looked around at the townspeople watching from a distance, at the schoolhouse that represented everything he'd wanted to build, but would now never see completed. "I told you I left my unit to go home when my family was sick. What I didn't say was that I'd requested leave 3 times and been denied each time. The commanding officer said the war came first, that soldiers didn't get to run home every time they got worried letters." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "So you went anyway." Margaret's letters were getting more desperate. She wrote that James was calling for me, that she didn't know how much longer. His voice broke. "I couldn't stay and fight someone else's battles while my own family died alone. So yes, I left without permission. I deserted. And when you got home, they were already buried. I'd thrown away my honor, my service record, everything for nothing. I was too late to save them and too much of a coward to go back and face the consequences." Silas met her eyes, and Clara saw decade-old guilt burning there. "I've been running ever since." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, not just for the tragedy of his losses, but for the impossible choice he'd been forced to make. "You chose love over duty, a father's duty to his family over a soldier's duty to his country. A choice that makes me a criminal in the eyes of the law." "Then the law is wrong," Clara said fiercely, surprising them both with her vehemence. Marshal Cross was approaching again, his expression impatient. "Time's up, Boone. Let's go." As Silas was led toward the waiting horses, Clara made a decision that would have astounded her cautious Boston self. "Marshal Cross, I'm requesting a hearing, a formal review of this case before you take him away." Cross paused, eyebrows raised. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that circumstances matter, that justice requires more than blind adherence to rules written by men who never had to choose between duty to country and duty to family." Clara's voice grew stronger with each word. "This man has spent 10 years punishing himself for a choice that should have earned him compassion, not condemnation." "Ma'am, I don't have authority to—" "Then find someone who does," Clara interrupted. "This community stands behind Silas Boone. We demand he be given a fair hearing before being condemned for choosing his dying family over military bureaucracy." A murmur of agreement rose from the gathered townspeople. Mayor Henderson stepped forward. "Miss Finch speaks for all of us, Marshal. This man has earned our respect and support." Cross looked around at the determined faces surrounding him, clearly uncomfortable with the situation becoming a public spectacle. "I'll send a telegram to my superiors," he said finally, "but until I hear back, Boone remains in custody." As Silas was helped onto a horse, his hands bound, he looked back at Clara with something she'd never seen in his eyes before, hope mixed with desperate love. "Thank you," he said quietly, and Clara knew he meant for more than just demanding a hearing. As the marshal's party rode away, taking with them the man she'd come to love, Clara stood in the shadow of the schoolhouse they'd built together and realized that the real test of her commitment to second chances was just beginning. Clara spent the first night after Silas's arrest, pacing her small room at Murphy's boarding house, her mind racing through legal precedents and desperate plans. She had demanded a hearing, but what good would that do if she couldn't present compelling evidence of Silas's character and circumstances? The federal government had little patience for emotional appeals, especially regarding military justice. By dawn, Clara had formulated a strategy that would have seemed impossible to her former self, the quiet Boston widow who had never challenged authority or fought for anything more controversial than better library funding. But losing Thomas had taught her that some things were worth any risk, and watching Silas arrested had awakened a fierce protectiveness she didn't know she possessed. Her first step was to send telegrams to every contact she could think of who might have influence or information. Thomas had corresponded with colleagues across the country, and Clara still had their addresses. She sent carefully worded messages to professors, military chaplains, and government officials, asking for any information about policies regarding compassionate leave during the war, precedents for reviewing desertion cases, and character references for Professor Silas Boone of Millbrook College. The response from Major Henderson's office came within 2 days, a terse telegram stating that a military hearing would be convened in Willow Bend within the week, but that Clara should not expect mercy for a clear case of desertion during wartime. Clara's second telegram brought better news. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a colleague of Thomas's who now served as a military chaplain, wrote that he remembered the Boone case and would travel to Kansas to testify. His message hinted that there were aspects of the situation that the military tribunal should consider. But Clara's greatest hope came from an unexpected source. Timothy's mother, Sarah Morrison, approached her 3 days after the arrest with a worn envelope in her hands. "Miss Finch," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about Mr. Boone's situation. My husband died in the war, as you know, but before he did, he wrote letters about the men in his unit. He mentioned a Professor Boone who'd been trying desperately to get leave to tend to his sick family." Clara's heart leaped. "You have letters from your husband mentioning Silas?" "More than that," Sarah said, producing several sheets of paper. John wrote about how the commanding officer refused Professor Boone's requests for leave, even when it became clear his wife and child were dying. John thought it was cruel, especially since Professor Boone had already distinguished himself in battle. Clara read through the letters with growing excitement and anger. Timothy's father had written in detail about Silas's service record, how he'd volunteered for dangerous reconnaissance missions, how he'd saved wounded soldiers under fire, how he'd used his education to help illiterate men write letters home. The letters painted a picture of a man who had served with exceptional honor before making the desperate choice to leave. "There's more," Sarah continued. John wrote that Professor Boone's commanding officer had a reputation for denying leave requests out of spite. Several men had similar problems, but most didn't have families in such dire straits. Clara clutched the letters to her chest. This was exactly the kind of evidence that might sway a military tribunal testimony from a fellow soldier about the circumstances surrounding Silas's desertion and his exemplary service before that desperate act. Her next step was to organize community support. Clara called a town meeting, and to her amazement, nearly every family in Willow Bend attended. She explained the situation honestly, holding nothing back about Silas's past or the charges against him. "This man built our schoolhouse," she said, standing before the crowded room. "He worked with our children, shared his knowledge freely, asked for nothing but basic sustenance in return. He made a desperate choice 10 years ago, chose his dying family over military regulations. Are we going to stand by and watch him be destroyed for that choice?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Mayor Henderson offered to testify about Silas's character. Dr. Phillips spoke about how Silas had helped treat injured townspeople with medical knowledge gained during his military service. Mrs. Murphy described his respectful behavior and generous spirit. Most movingly, Timothy stood up, his young voice shaking with emotion. "Mr. Boone taught me that numbers aren't just for counting," the boy said. "He taught me about triangles and pyramids and how learning connects everything. He made me want to be smart, to know things. If being smart is wrong, then why are we building a school?" Clara felt tears blur her vision at the boy's simple wisdom. Here was the heart of her argument, that Silas's value as a teacher and human being should outweigh the technicalities of military law. But Clara knew emotional appeals alone wouldn't be enough. She spent the next 2 days crafting a formal brief, drawing on her years of helping Thomas with his academic writing. She researched military law, precedents for posthumous pardons, and cases where exceptional circumstances had led to reduced sentences. She documented every act of service and kindness Silas had performed in Willow Bend, creating a portfolio that presented him as a man seeking redemption, not avoiding responsibility. The most crucial piece of evidence came in a telegram from Dr. Morrison 2 days before the hearing. His message was brief but explosive. "Found military chaplain's report from 1864. Boone officially recommended for compassionate leave. Approval lost in administrative confusion. Will bring documentation. Case stronger than expected." Clara's hands trembled as she read the telegram. If there was official documentation that Silas's leave had been approved but never communicated to him, it would completely change the nature of his desertion. He wouldn't be a soldier who abandoned his post. He would be a man following orders that never reached him. The night before the hearing, Clara sat in the empty schoolhouse, surrounded by the evidence she'd gathered. The building felt different without Silas's presence, incomplete despite being structurally finished. She looked up at the wooden cross above the doorframe, at the Latin words he'd carved there, spes et fides, hope and faith. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Clara opened it to find Timothy standing in the darkness, his young face serious with purpose. "Miss Finch, I wanted to give you this." He held out a piece of wood, carved with careful letters. "Mr. Boone was teaching me to carve words. This is the first one I finished by myself." Clara accepted the small wooden plaque, reading the word Timothy had painstakingly carved, teacher. Below it, in smaller letters, he'd added, M.R. Boone. He said that teaching is the most important job in the world, Timothy explained, because teachers help people become who they're supposed to be. I think Mr. Boone forgot that he's supposed to be a teacher. Clara knelt down to the boy's level, her heart full of love for this wise child. "What makes you think that?" "Because he got sad when he looked at me sometimes," Timothy said simply. "Ma says it's because I remind him of his little boy who died. But I think he should be happy that he can still teach children, even if they're not his own children. I think his little boy would want him to keep teaching." Clara hugged Timothy, overwhelmed by his insight and compassion. Here was the argument she'd been struggling to articulate, that Silas's greatest tribute to his lost son would be to continue nurturing young minds, not to waste his gifts in self-imposed exile. After Timothy left, Clara spent the rest of the night preparing her final arguments. She would present the legal evidence first, the military service records, the documentation of his exceptional conduct, the proof that his leave may have been officially approved. Then she would make the moral case that a man who chose his dying family over military bureaucracy deserved compassion, not condemnation. Finally, she would argue for the future that Silas Boone, the teacher, could do more good for his country, educating frontier children, than Silas Boone, the prisoner, could do, rotting in military jail. As dawn broke over the prairie, Clara felt as prepared as she could be for the fight ahead. She had facts, witnesses, and moral arguments on her side. But most importantly, she had love. Love for a man who had forgotten his own worth. Love for a community willing to stand up for justice. And love for the ideal that second chances should be available to those brave enough to seek redemption. The hearing would determine whether that love was strong enough to overcome the rigid machinery of military justice. Clara touched the wooden cross one more time, whispering a prayer for hope and faith to carry them through the trial ahead. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the town beginning to wake families preparing to attend the hearing, voices raised in support of the man who had built their children's future with his own hands. Whatever happened in the courtroom today, Silas would not face it alone. Clara gathered her papers, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to fight for the man she loved and the principle she believed in. That redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to seek it, and that society was stronger when it chose mercy over vengeance. The battle for Silas Boone's freedom and his soul was about to begin. The military hearing convened at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning in the very schoolhouse Silas had built. The irony was not lost on Clara. The building that represented hope and new beginnings would now serve as the courtroom where Silas's fate would be decided. Colonel James Whitmore, a stern man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much war, presided over the proceedings. He'd brought a court stenographer and 2 junior officers to serve as advisors, transforming Clara's cheerful classroom into a formal military tribunal. Silas sat at a makeshift defendant's table, still wearing the simple work clothes he'd been arrested in. His hands were unshackled, but his posture spoke of a man who had already accepted his fate. Clara wanted desperately to offer him encouragement, but the formal proceedings allowed no such comfort. Marshal Cross presented the government's case with efficient brevity. He read the charges: desertion during wartime, abandonment of military duty, failure to return to service after unauthorized leave. The facts were simple and damning. Private Silas Boone had left his unit without permission in March 1864 and never returned. The defendant's motivations are irrelevant to military law. Cross concluded, desertion is desertion, regardless of personal circumstances. The penalty prescribed by military justice is clear. Colonel Whitmore nodded gravely. Mr. Boone, how do you plead to these charges? Silas stood slowly, his voice steady but resigned. Guilty, sir. I left my post without permission. I broke my oath as a soldier. A murmur ran through the packed schoolhouse. Clara's heart sank at his immediate admission, though she understood his reluctance to deny the basic facts. But a guilty plea would make her defense much more difficult. Very well, Colonel Whitmore said. Given the defendant's plea, this tribunal will proceed directly to sentencing unless there are mitigating circumstances to consider. Clara rose from her seat. Colonel Whitmore, I request permission to present evidence of mitigating circumstances and character witnesses on behalf of Mr. Boone. The colonel studied her with mild curiosity. You are? Clara Finch, schoolteacher and friend of the defendant. I've prepared a comprehensive brief detailing the exceptional circumstances surrounding Mr. Boone's actions and his exemplary conduct, both during and after his military service. Colonel Whitmore consulted with his advisers in whispered tones. Finally, he nodded. The tribunal will hear your evidence, Miss Finch. However, I caution you that personal hardship does not excuse abandonment of military duty. Clara stood and walked to the front of the schoolhouse, acutely aware that every eye in the room was upon her. She had one chance to save the man she loved, and everything depended on her ability to make these military men see Silas as more than just a deserter. Gentlemen, I do not dispute the basic facts of this case, Clara began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Private Silas Boone did leave his post in March 1864, but the circumstances of his departure and his conduct, both before and after that desperate act, tell a story that deserves your consideration. She approached the table where she'd arranged her evidence. First, let me present testimony regarding Private Boone's military service record prior to March 1864. Clara read from the letters Timothy's father had written, documenting Silas's bravery under fire, his volunteer service on dangerous missions, his use of his education to help fellow soldiers. She presented statements from other veterans who remembered his exceptional conduct and his repeated, denied requests for compassionate leave. This was not a coward seeking an easy escape from duty, Clara said firmly. This was a soldier with an exemplary record, driven to desperate action by impossible circumstances. She then produced Dr. Morrison's telegram and supporting documentation. Furthermore, gentlemen, I have evidence that Private Boone's leave may have been officially approved, but that approval was lost in administrative confusion, typical of that chaotic period of the war. Colonel Whitmore leaned forward with interest. Explain this alleged approval. Clara handed him the chaplain's report Dr. Morrison had referenced. Military Chaplain Samuel Morrison filed an official recommendation for compassionate leave for Private Boone in February 1864. This recommendation was approved by the regimental commander, but apparently never communicated to Boone's immediate superior or to Boone himself due to administrative failures. The colonel studied the document carefully, his expression unreadable. This suggests bureaucratic incompetence, not criminal desertion. Exactly, sir. Private Boone acted on what he believed to be denied requests for leave, not knowing that approval had actually been granted at a higher level. Clara felt a surge of hope as she saw the colonel's interest in this revelation. Even if this documentation is accurate, Marshal Cross interjected, it doesn't change the fact that Boone never returned to service after his family emergency was resolved. Clara had anticipated this objection. Marshal Cross raises a valid point, but I would ask this tribunal to consider the psychological impact of Private Boone's experiences. He returned from leave to find his wife and infant son already buried, having died while calling for him. The guilt and grief of that discovery, combined with what he perceived as his commanding officer's callous refusal to grant leave, led to a complete mental collapse. She gestured toward Silas, whose face had gone pale at her description of his darkest moments. This man didn't consciously choose ongoing desertion. He fled from unbearable pain and has spent the last 10 years punishing himself more severely than any military court could devise. Colonel Whitmore looked thoughtful. You're arguing diminished capacity due to grief and trauma. I'm arguing human compassion, sir, and I'm asking this tribunal to consider what Private Boone has done with the years since his breakdown. Clara turned to face the crowded schoolhouse. I called Timothy Morrison to testify about the character of the man you're considering punishing. Timothy Morrison walked to the front of the schoolhouse with the solemn dignity of a boy trying to be brave for the adults who mattered to him. At 12 years old, he was small for his age, but his voice carried clearly through the hushed room. "State your name for the record," Colonel Whitmore said gently, clearly moved despite himself by the sight of the earnest child. "Timothy Morrison, sir. My pa died at Gettysburg serving under Captain Williams." The colonel nodded respectfully. "What can you tell us about Mr. Boone?" Timothy looked directly at Silas, his young face shining with admiration. "Mr. Boone taught me that everything is connected. Numbers and building and history and even the stars, it's all one big conversation," he said. "He showed me how triangles work the same in Egypt and in our barn, how the Romans used math to build roads that are still there today." Clara felt her throat tighten as Timothy spoke with the enthusiasm of a child whose world had been opened by a gifted teacher. "He never got impatient when I asked questions," Timothy continued, "even when I asked the same thing over and over because I didn't understand. He said that good questions are more important than quick answers, and that learning takes time but lasts forever." "Did Mr. Boone ever speak to you about his military service?" Colonel Whitmore asked. Timothy nodded seriously. "He said that soldiers fight so that children can go to school instead of to war. He said his job now was to make sure kids like me could learn about beautiful things instead of ugly ones." Marshal Cross leaned forward. "Did he ever express any regret about his military service?" "Oh, yes, sir," Timothy replied immediately. "He was very sad about leaving his unit. He told me that sometimes we have to choose between two important things, and that the choice might be right, but still hurt forever. He said he chose his little boy over his soldier friends, and that both choices would have been painful." Clara saw Silas's eyes fill with tears at Timothy's simple summary of his agonizing decision. "Mr. Boone helped me understand that my pa chose to fight so I could have choices too," Timothy added. "He said that's what makes America different, that people can make their own choices, even hard ones." Colonel Whitmore dismissed Timothy with gentle thanks, but Clara could see that the boy's testimony had affected him deeply. She called several more witnesses, Mayor Henderson speaking about Silas's service to the community, Dr. Phillips describing his medical knowledge and willingness to help during emergencies, Mrs. Murphy testifying to his respectful behavior and generous spirit. But Clara's most powerful witness arrived just as she was concluding her character testimony. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the military chaplain Thomas had contacted, entered the schoolhouse carrying a leather satchel that Clara prayed contained the documentation that could save Silas. "Dr. Morrison," Clara said, "can you tell the tribunal about your knowledge of this case?" The chaplain, a distinguished man with kind eyes and a bearing that commanded respect, addressed Colonel Whitmore directly. "Sir, I served as regimental chaplain during the period in question. I personally handled Private Boone's request for compassionate leave." Colonel Whitmore straightened with interest. "You have direct knowledge of the administrative situation?" "I do, sir." Dr. Morrison opened his satchel and withdrew several official documents. "I have here the original compassionate leave request, my endorsement recommending approval, and the regimental commander's signed authorization granting Private Boone 30 days emergency leave to tend to his dying family." A stunned silence fell over the room. Clara felt her heart hammering as she realized that this documentation could completely exonerate Silas. Furthermore, Dr. Beese, Morrison continued, I have correspondence showing that this approval was forwarded to division headquarters, but never transmitted back down to the company level due to a clerical error. Private Boone's immediate commanding officer never received notification that the leave had been granted. Marshal Cross stood up abruptly. May I examine those documents? Colonel Whitmore nodded, and the papers were passed between the officials. Clara watched anxiously as they studied the evidence that could transform Silas from a deserter into a victim of military bureaucracy. These documents appear authentic, Colonel Whitmore said after several tense minutes. If accurate, they indicate that Private Boone was operating under officially approved leave when he departed his unit. But he never returned after his emergency leave expired, Marshal Cross pointed out. Dr. Morrison nodded gravely. That's true. However, I would direct the tribunal's attention to the final document in that packet, a letter from Private Boone to me, written after he discovered his family had died. In it, he expresses his intention to return to duty, but admits to being in a state of complete mental collapse. The chaplain's voice grew compassionate. Gentlemen, I've counseled many soldiers dealing with loss and trauma. Private Boone's psychological state, as described in his letter, was that of a man temporarily incapable of rational decision-making. He wasn't choosing desertion, he was lost in grief so profound it rendered him unable to function as a soldier or anything else. Colonel Whitmore examined the letter, his expression grave. This puts an entirely different complexion on the case. Clara held her breath, sensing they were at the crucial moment. Colonel, I submit that the evidence shows Private Boone to be not a deserter, but a dedicated soldier broken by loss and betrayed by administrative incompetence. The question before this tribunal is not whether to punish him for crimes he didn't commit, but whether to recognize his service and help him reclaim the productive life he's been rebuilding. The colonel looked at Silas, who sat stunned by these revelations. Mr. Boone, did you know your leave had been officially approved? Silas shook his head, his voice barely audible. No, sir. I was told repeatedly that such requests were being denied, that the war came first. I believed I was breaking military law when I left. And yet you left anyway. Yes, sir. I couldn't let my family die alone, even if it meant court-martial. Silas's voice grew stronger. I've spent 10 years believing I was a coward and a traitor. Learning that my leave was approved, it doesn't change the pain of losing them, but it changes everything else. Colonel Whitmore conferred with his advisors in hushed tones that seemed to last forever. Colonel Whitmore finally looked up from his conference with the junior officers, his expression grave but no longer harsh. The entire schoolhouse held its breath as he prepared to deliver his judgment. This tribunal has reviewed the evidence presented regarding the case of Private Silas Boone, he began, his voice carrying the weight of military authority tempered by human understanding. The documentation provided by Chaplain Morrison clearly establishes that Private Boone's initial departure from his unit was covered by officially approved compassionate leave, though that approval was never properly communicated through the chain of command. Clara felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, but she forced herself to remain steady. This was only the beginning of the colonel's ruling. However, Whitmore continued, the matter of Private Boone's failure to return to duty after his emergency leave expired remains to be addressed. He paused, studying Silas with eyes that seemed to see beyond the weathered exterior to the man within. The evidence of psychological trauma resulting from the loss of his family, combined with his belief that he had deserted his post, provides compelling context for his continued absence. The colonel stood, and everyone in the room rose with him out of respect. Furthermore, this tribunal notes that Private Boone has spent the subsequent years not in flight from responsibility, but in service to others, building schools, teaching children, contributing to frontier communities that desperately need educated, principled citizens. Clara's heart was racing now, hope and fear warring in her chest as she waited for the final verdict. Therefore, it is the ruling of this tribunal that Private Silas Boone is hereby cleared of all charges of desertion and dereliction of duty. Whitmore's voice grew warmer. The record will reflect that he served with distinction and was granted appropriate compassionate leave during a family emergency. His failure to return to active duty is attributed to psychological trauma and administrative confusion, not criminal intent. The schoolhouse erupted in cheers and applause. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she saw Silas's expression transform from resigned despair to stunned disbelief to overwhelming gratitude. Timothy whooped with joy, and Mrs. Murphy was openly weeping with happiness. But Colonel Whitmore wasn't finished. He raised his hand for silence, and when the room quieted, his expression had softened completely. "Furthermore," he said, "based on the testimony regarding Private Boone's service record and his contributions to this community, this tribunal recommends him for official commendation for meritorious service, both during and after his military duty. The Army owes you an apology, Mr. Boone, not a prison sentence." Silas stood on shaking legs, struggling to process this complete reversal of everything he'd believed about himself for 10 years. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept the commission I'm about to offer you," Colonel Whitmore replied with the ghost of a smile. "The territorial government has been seeking qualified individuals to establish schools in frontier communities. Given your educational background and proven commitment to teaching, I'm authorized to offer you a position as Territorial Education Supervisor. With full military pension restored and back pay for the years of service, the Army failed to properly recognize." Clara's heart soared at this unexpected turn. Not only was Silas cleared of all charges, but he was being offered official recognition and support for the work he'd already been doing. Silas looked around the room, his eyes finding Clara's, among the sea of supportive faces. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw no shadows of guilt or self-doubt in his expression, only wonder at this second chance he'd never dared hope for. "Colonel," Silas said, his voice steady and strong, "I'm honored by your offer. But before I accept any position, I need to know, would I be free to continue teaching here in Willow Bend? This community took me in when I was lost, and these children have reminded me why education matters." "Mr. Boone," Whitmore replied, "you'd be free to establish your base of operations anywhere in the territory. If Willow Bend is where you want to make your stand, the territorial government will support you fully." As the formal proceedings concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Clara found herself alone with Silas for the first time since his arrest. They stood in the schoolhouse they'd built together, surrounded by the promise of all the learning that would take place within these walls. "Clara," Silas said quietly, "I owe you everything. Without your faith in me—" "You owe me nothing," Clara interrupted. "But I have a question for you." "Anything." Clara reached into her satchel and withdrew the simple wooden ring Silas had been carving during their evening conversations. She'd found it among his belongings after his arrest, recognizing it immediately as a wedding band, crafted with the same care he brought to everything he touched. "Were you making this for someone in particular?" she asked, holding up the ring. Silas's face flushed, but his eyes were steady and full of love. "I was making it for the woman who saved my life by refusing to let me believe I was beyond redemption. The woman who fought for me when I'd given up fighting for myself." Clara felt her heart overflow with joy. "Then I accept, Professor Boone. But I have one condition." "Name it." "We teach together, not as supervisor and assistant, but as equal partners in this grand adventure of education." Clara gestured around the schoolhouse, already imagining it filled with students of all ages, eager to learn from both of them. "What do you say to co-principals of the Willow Bend School?" Silas's smile was radiant as he slipped the wooden ring onto Clara's finger, where it settled perfectly beside Thomas's gold band past and future united in the promise of love that honored both. "I say it's the finest partnership I could ever imagine," he replied, and sealed their engagement with a kiss that tasted of hope fulfilled and dreams reborn. Outside the schoolhouse windows, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, golden with autumn grass and bright with possibility. Above the door, Silas's wooden cross caught the afternoon sunlight, its carved words visible to all who entered. Spes et fides, hope and faith. The schoolhouse that had begun as Clara's attempt to start over had become something far greater, a symbol of second chances, the power of community, and the truth that love, like learning, could transform even the most wounded hearts. In the months and years that followed, the Willow Bend School would become known throughout the territory for its innovative methods, its compassionate teachers, and its proof that the best education comes from those who understand that wisdom is earned through both joy and sorrow. But on this day, as Clara and Silas stood hand in hand in their completed schoolhouse, surrounded by the evidence of what faith and determination could accomplish, they were simply two people who had found their way home to love, learning, and the endless possibility of new beginnings.